Sulfur. That is what the air smelled like on the morning the sky over the Jordan Valley turned the color of a furnace. Not smoke, not ash. Sulfur. Sharp, yellow. The smell of a struck match held too close to your face. A man named Lot smelled it before he saw anything. And by the time he turned to look, the two cities he had called home for years were already gone. You have heard this story. You think you know it. A wicked place, a rain of fire, a woman who looked back and turned to salt. You file it away as one of those Old Testament moments, dramatic, distant, the kind of thing that happened once, a long time ago, to people who deserved it. But here's what most people miss. Fire did not fall from heaven only once. It fell again, and again, and again. It fell on a desert altar. It fell inside a tent so holy that touching the wrong thing inside it could kill you. It fell on a mountain in front of an entire nation. It fell on soldiers. It fell on a king's threshing floor to stop a plague. It fell on a temple and filled it with so much glory the priests could not stand up. And then, at the very end of the pattern, after centuries of fire that meant run, it fell one last time. On a Sunday morning, in a crowded upstairs room, on a group of frightened, ordinary people, and it did not burn them. This is the part I want you to hold on to for the next 50 minutes because everything builds toward it. There is one more fire coming in this story, and it is the only fire in the entire Bible that a human being could stand inside and live. We will get to that fire, but not yet, because to understand why the last one matters, you have to feel the weight of all the ones that came before. You have to smell the sulfur first. So this is not a story about punishment. This is not a story about a short-tempered God hurling lightning when he gets angry. This is not a story about destruction for its own sake. This is a story about what fire was always for, and the slow, terrifying, beautiful journey from the fire that ends everything to the fire that begins it. Let's start where it started. Let's start with Sodom. The Hebrew word for fire is esh. It shows up more than 300 times across the Old Testament, and almost every time it carries the same double meaning. Fire as the thing that destroys, and fire as the thing that marks where God is. Keep that double meaning in your pocket. You are going to need it later. Now picture the scene before the burning. Two travelers arrive at the gate of Sodom at evening. Lot is sitting there. And that detail matters, because the gate is where the leaders of a city sat. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, the man who once chose this lush valley because it looked like paradise, has settled in deep. He has a house. He has a family. He has a seat at the gate of a city the Bible describes in language so dark that for thousands of years, people have used its name as a synonym for ruin. The travelers are not travelers. You know that, and Lot does not. They are messengers. And what happens that night confirms everything God already knew about the place. A mob surrounds Lot's house. Not a few angry men. The text says all the people from every quarter, young and old, the entire city gathered at one door, demanding to commit violence against two strangers. That is the moment the verdict becomes final. But here is what gets lost in the rush to the fire. Before a single spark falls, there is a conversation. Go back one chapter. Abraham, Lot's uncle, stands before God and does something almost no one in Scripture dares to do. He bargains. He negotiates with the Almighty over the fate of a city full of strangers. Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? He asks. What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? God says, for 50 I will spare it all. And then Abraham does this extraordinary trembling thing. He keeps going. 45, 40, 30, 20. He talks God down step by step, like a man haggling in a marketplace, while his own heart pounds in his chest. And each time God says yes, down to 10. For 10 righteous people, the Lord says, I will not destroy it. Sit with that for a second. The God you have been told throws fire when he's angry just agreed, out loud on the record, to spare 2 entire cities for the sake of 10 decent people. They could not find 10. That is the grief underneath this story. Stop and let that land. The fire did not fall because God was looking for an excuse. It fell because a search was made, a real search, a house-by-house search for 10 decent people in 2 whole cities. And it came up empty. The destruction was not the first option. It was the last one after every other door had been tried and shut. So the messengers grab Lot by the hand. The text literally says they seized his hand because he hesitated. And they drag him and his wife and his daughters out the gate as the eastern sky begins to change. And then the Esh comes down. Fire and brimstone, gophereth in Hebrew, burning sulfur, out of the heavens, the cities, the valley, everything that grew in the ground, gone in a morning. Lot's wife looks back. You know what happens to her. But I want you to understand why the text bothers to tell us. She doesn't just glance over her shoulder out of curiosity. She looks back because part of her still belongs there. Her heart never made it out of the gate. And the fire that consumed the city consumed everyone whose heart was still inside it. Here's something you can still touch today. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing for a Roman audience around the time the apostles were still alive, described the region near the Dead Sea. He wrote about ground scorched and barren, about ash and ruin still faintly visible. The shadow, as he understood it, of a fire that had fallen there long before. Whatever you make of the details, the memory of this event was not some fairy tale to the ancient world. It was geography. It was a place you could walk to and smell the difference. So that is fire number 1, the fire that ends a world. And if the story stopped there, you would have every reason to believe what most people believe, that fire from heaven is simply God's weapon, the thing he reaches for when patience runs out. But it gets stranger, because the very next time fire falls from heaven, it does not fall on a wicked city. It falls inside the holiest room God's people ever built. Stay with me. Move forward several hundred years. The descendants of Abraham are no longer one family. They are a nation just rescued from slavery in Egypt, camped in the desert at the foot of a mountain. And the mountain is on fire. Don't miss this, because it sets up everything that follows. When God comes down to meet the whole nation at Mount Sinai, he does not come as a voice or a light or a gentle presence. The text says, the Lord descended on it in fire, and the smoke billowed up like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. There is thunder, there is lightning, there is a trumpet blast that grows louder and louder until the people are shaking, and God draws a hard line around the base of the mountain and says, do not touch it. Do not even let an animal wander up here. Anyone who touches this mountain dies. Here is a nation that has watched God split a sea and drown an army. And they are so terrified of the fire on that mountain that they beg Moses, "You speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us or we will die." They cannot bear the nearness of the fire. They want a man to stand between them and it. Remember that. A whole nation begging for someone to stand between them and the fire. We are going to come back to that exact problem, and we are going to watch God solve it. But it takes the entire Bible to get there. So that is the world these people live in. Fire means God is here, and God being here is the most dangerous thing imaginable. And it is into that world that God gives them something no people on earth had ever been given: instructions for how to build a place where he would actually live among them. The tabernacle, a tent, but a tent unlike any other, layered in gold and blue and crimson, with an inner room so sacred that one wrong step inside it meant death. On the day it is finished and dedicated, something happens that the people have been waiting their whole lives to see. Aaron, the high priest, finishes the first sacrifices. And then fire from the Lord comes out and consumes the offering on the altar. The people see it and they shout, and they fall on their faces. That is good fire. That is the fire of acceptance, the fire that says, "I am here, I have received this, I have come to live with you." Mark that, because it is the first hint that fire from heaven was never only about destruction. But the very next verses turn that joy into horror. 2 of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, young priests, sons of the high priest himself, men who had climbed part way up that holy mountain and lived, take their censers, put fire in them, add incense, and offer what the text calls eshzara, strange fire, unauthorized fire, fire God did not command. We are not told exactly what they did wrong. Some think they were drunk because of the warning about wine that comes immediately after. Some think they invented their own ritual, mixed their own recipe, decided that the way God laid out was a suggestion rather than a command. What we know is this: they treated the holiest fire in the world as if it were ordinary, as if they could improvise with it, and fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them. The same fire that moments earlier had been a sign of joy and welcome now took 2 lives in front of everyone. Here's the part nobody tells you. Aaron, the father, who just watched 2 of his sons die at the altar, is forbidden to mourn. God tells him through Moses, "Do not loosen your hair. Do not tear your clothes. Do not show grief, or you too will die, and the whole nation will pay." And the text gives us 4 of the most devastating words in the Old Testament. And Aaron held his peace. He said nothing. A father standing over the bodies of his children in the most agonizing silence in Scripture. Why does this matter? Because it tells you something the Sodom story alone could not. Fire from heaven is not about who is wicked enough to deserve it. Nadab and Abihu were not Sodom. They were priests. They were insiders. They were close. Closer than almost anyone alive. And that closeness is exactly what made the carelessness so deadly. You can feel the temperature of this changing already. The fire is not asking, "Are you evil?" It is asking, "Do you understand what you are standing near?" If you're getting something out of this, if you've never had these stories connected like this before, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button. This channel exists to walk through the parts of the Bible most people skip past, the way they were meant to be felt and not just read. And while you're down there, tell me in the comments, which of these fires have you actually heard taught before? Most people know Sodom. Almost nobody knows about Aaron's silence. I want to see where you land. Subscribe, drop a comment, and let's keep going. Because the next fire does not fall on 2 men. It falls on 250. Pay attention to this. The nation is still in the wilderness. And in the wilderness, something happens that happens in every group of human beings eventually. People get tired of being led. A man named Korah, a Levite, a relative of Moses, someone with real standing, gathers 250 community leaders, prominent men of reputation, and confronts Moses and Aaron. Their complaint sounds almost reasonable. You take too much on yourselves, they say. The whole community is holy, every one of them. Why do you set yourselves above the people? It sounds like democracy. It sounds like fairness. And underneath it is the same thing that killed Nadab and Abihu. The belief that the line between the holy and the ordinary is a line you get to redraw whenever it inconveniences you. Moses does not argue. He proposes a test. Tomorrow morning, he says, every one of you take a censer, put fire and incense in it, and stand before the Lord, and the Lord will show who belongs to him. Now watch what happens next. The 250 show up, censers lit, incense burning, standing at the entrance to the tent, certain they have as much right to that fire as anyone. The ground beneath the ringleader splits open and swallows them and their households alive. That is its own terrifying scene. But for the 250 holding their censers, the verdict comes from above. Fire came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were offering the incense. And then comes a detail so haunting, I want to make sure you catch it. God commands that the bronze censers, the very ones those men were holding when they died, be hammered flat and used to overlay the altar. A permanent reminder. Every future priest who approached that altar would be looking at the beaten down evidence of men who thought holy fire was theirs to grab. 3 fires now. Sodom, Aaron's sons, Korah's 250, and the pattern looks airtight. Fire from heaven destroys. Fire from heaven judges. Fire from heaven is the thing you do not want to be standing near when it comes. But hold that thought, because the 4th fire breaks the rhythm. The 4th fire does not fall to destroy anyone. It falls to save. Centuries pass. Israel now has kings, and the greatest of them is David. And near the end of David's life, he makes a catastrophic mistake. He orders a census, counts his fighting men, an act of pride, trusting numbers instead of the God who gave him every victory. And a plague breaks out. 70,000 people die. David, watching the angel of judgment standing with a drawn sword over Jerusalem, breaks. He cries out one of the most selfless prayers any king ever prayed. I am the one who has sinned. These are but sheep. Let your hand fall on me and my family, not on them. He is told to go to a specific place, a threshing floor, tifyat, a flat, open rock where farmers separated wheat from chaff, owned by a man named Aranah. David is to build an altar there. Araunah, seeing the king coming, offers to give him everything for free, the floor, the oxen, the wood. And David says something you should never forget. I will not offer to the Lord that which costs me nothing. He pays full price, he builds the altar, he calls on the Lord, and fire comes down from heaven on the altar of burnt offering and the plague stops. Do you feel the shift? Same fire, same falling from the sky fire that destroyed Sodom and consumed Korah's men. But here it lands on a sacrifice that one man bought at full cost, and instead of ending lives, it ends a plague. Instead of wrath, mercy. And the place where it fell, the Gagist, that threshing floor, becomes the exact ground where Solomon would later build the temple. The spot where the saving fire fell becomes the holiest address in Israel. Here's what most people miss about that. The fire didn't change. What changed was what stood between the fire and the people. At Sodom, nothing stood there. At Araunah's threshing floor, a bought and paid for sacrifice stood there, and the fire fell on the offering instead of on the nation. Tuck that away. It is the key to the whole climax. And before we get to the most famous fire in the Old Testament, I want to show you two quiet ones that almost nobody talks about, because they prove the fire was never only a weapon. Go back to the time of the judges, to a frightened young man named Gideon, hiding in a wine press, threshing wheat in secret because his enemies would steal it if they saw. An angel appears and tells him he is going to save Israel. Gideon does not believe it. He asks for proof. So he prepares an offering, meat and broth and bread, and sets it on a rock. And the angel reaches out with the tip of his staff and touches it, and fire flares up out of the rock and consumes the offering. Watch what that fire does. It does not punish Gideon for doubting. It does not consume the doubter. It consumes the offering. And it turns a terrified man hiding in a wine press into the deliverer of his nation. That is fire as a commissioning. Fire that says, I have chosen you, and I am with you. And there is one more like it. A childless couple, Manoah and his wife, are visited by the angel of the Lord, who promises them a son, a boy who will grow up to be Samson. Manoah, like Gideon, prepares an offering on a rock, and as the flame goes up from the altar toward heaven, the angel of the Lord ascends in the flame. He rides the fire up. Manoah and his wife fall on their faces, certain they will die because they have seen God. But they don't die. They go home and have a son. Keep that in front of you. Two ordinary people, a fire, and instead of death, a future. The fire that destroyed Sodom is the same fire that promised a baby to a barren woman. Same Esh. Completely different result. And the difference every single time is what the fire falls on and why. And it gets remarkable from here because the next time fire falls, it falls on the most public stage in the Old Testament. One prophet, 450 enemies, an entire kingdom watching. This is the one you've probably heard of. But I promise, you have not heard it like this. His name is Elijah. Israel has rotted. King Ahab and his queen Jezebel had dragged the nation into the worship of Baal, a storm god, a fertility god, the god people believed sent rain and fire and made the crops grow. And Elijah alone calls for a showdown on Mount Carmel. He invites the whole nation. He invites the 450 prophets of Baal, and he proposes a contest that is at its heart about fire. 2 altars, 2 bulls. no one lights anything. You call on the name of your God, Elijah says, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God. And the people agree. Of course they do. Everyone wants to see fire fall. The prophets of Baal go first, or they have the whole morning. They call on Baal, the God whose entire job description includes hurling fire from the sky. Nothing. They shout louder. Nothing. By noon, Elijah is mocking them, and the line he uses is so blunt that translators have softened it for centuries. Maybe your God is busy, he says. Maybe he's traveling. Maybe he's relieving himself. Maybe he's asleep, and someone needs to wake him. They start cutting themselves with swords and spears until the blood flows. They rave all afternoon. The sky stays silent, empty, dead. Picture standing in that crowd. The sun climbing and falling. 450 men, screaming themselves hoarse, dancing around an altar, slashing their own arms, growing more desperate by the hour, while a single man stands off to the side and waits. The whole nation is watching their old religion fail in real time. And the silence over that altar gets louder than any of the shouting. Then Elijah's turn. And here's where you see a man who is absolutely certain. He doesn't just build an altar. He rebuilds the broken altar of the Lord with 12 stones, one for each tribe. A quiet sermon in stone reminding a divided nation who they really are. He digs a trench around it. He arranges the wood, cuts up the bull, and then, watch this. He tells them to drench the whole thing in water. 4 large jars. Do it again. A 3rd time, until the water runs down the sides and fills the trench to the brim. Water in a land cracked by 3 years of drought. Water that was precious as silver, poured out until everything is soaked through. He is removing every possible explanation. No hidden coals, no dry kindling, no trick. Soaked wood does not light. He is not just asking for fire. He is daring God to do the impossible in front of everyone. Then he prays. Not a frenzy, not screaming. A short, quiet, devastating prayer. Lord, let it be known today that you are God, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all this at your word. Answer me, so these people will know that you are the Lord and that you are turning their hearts back. And the fire of the Lord fell. It consumed the sacrifice. It consumed the wood. It consumed the stones. Not the offering on the altar itself. It consumed the dust, and it licked up the water in the trench. The whole nation falls on their faces crying, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." You want to understand why this story has survived 3,000 years? Because Elijah did not pray for himself. He prayed, "Turn their hearts back." The fire on Carmel was not about winning an argument. It was a rescue mission for a whole nation's faith. And it worked. But there's one more thing about Elijah and fire, and it's darker, and it's the one people use to accuse him. Not long after, a different king, Ahaziah, Ahab's son, falls through a lattice and injures himself. And instead of seeking the God of Israel, he sends messengers to consult a foreign god about whether he'll recover. Elijah intercepts them. The king, furious, sends a captain with 50 soldiers to bring the prophet in. The captain marches up to Elijah and gives an order. "Man of God," the king says, "come down." And Elijah says, "If I am a man of God, May fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men. And it does. The king sends a second captain with another 50. Same demand, more arrogant. Same fire. 100 soldiers gone. Now, this story makes people uncomfortable, and it should. But look closely. The third captain does something different. He climbs the hill and falls on his knees and begs, "Man of God, please, let my life and the lives of these 50 servants be precious in your sight." He doesn't summon the prophet, he pleads. And the angel of the Lord tells Elijah, "Go with him. Do not be afraid." No fire. Here's the part nobody tells you. The difference between the captains who burned and the captain who lived was not their job or their 50 men or their orders. It was the posture of their hearts. When they stood in front of the fire, 2 of them came to command God's prophet. 1 came on his knees. Fire from heaven has always been able to tell the difference. And the last thing fire ever did for Elijah is the strangest reversal yet. Because Elijah does not die. At the end of his life, walking with his successor Elisha, a chariot of fire and horses of fire suddenly appear and separate the 2 men, and Elijah is taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. The same prophet who called down fire that consumed 100 soldiers is now carried home by fire. The fire that had been a weapon in his hands becomes the vehicle that brings him to God. Elisha watches it climb the sky and cries out, and then it is gone, and he is left holding Elijah's cloak. Think about what that means inside the pattern we've been building. Fire fell on Sodom and ended lives. Fire fell on Korah's men and ended lives. But here fire comes down, and instead of taking a life, it carries one all the way home. The fire did not consume Elijah. It delivered him. We're moving into the home stretch now. And before we get to the fire that breaks every pattern we've built, I want to ask one thing of you. If this is hitting you, if you're sitting there realizing that fire from heaven is telling one connected story across the whole Bible, share this video with one person who needs to see it. Someone who thinks the Old Testament God and the New Testament God are 2 different beings. Because in about 5 minutes, I'm going to show you that they are not. Hit subscribe if you haven't. Share it with that one person and stay with me. Because this is where everything turns. There's one more thing. Solomon, David's son, finally builds the temple on that exact threshing floor where the saving fire fell. Think about that location for a second. The most sacred building in the history of Israel is constructed on the precise patch of rock where fire once came down to stop a plague. The address itself is a sermon. This is the place where the fire chose mercy. 7 years of construction. Cedar from Lebanon, gold over everything. Craftsmen pulled from across the known world. And on the day of dedication, the priests carry the ark, the gold-covered box that represented God's very throne on earth, into the innermost room, the Holy of Holies, a room so sacred that only one man could enter it, only 1 day a year. Solomon stands before the whole assembly and prays one of the longest, most beautiful prayers in the Old Testament, asking God to let his eyes be open toward this house, to hear his people when they pray toward this place. And the moment he finishes, fire comes down from heaven and consumes the offering, and the glory of the Lord fills the temple. So much glory that the priests cannot enter their own sanctuary. They cannot even stand. The same priests who spent their whole lives serving in that building have to back out the doors because the presence is too heavy, too thick, too bright to stand inside. Do you see what just happened? At Sodom, fire from heaven destroyed a building. At Sinai, fire on the mountain kept people out. Here, fire from heaven fills a building, and the thing that follows it is not death. It is glory so dense that human beings can't stay upright in it. The fire is changing direction in front of you. It started as the thing that wipes out a city. Now it's the thing that fills a house with the visible presence of God. And if you've been tracking the pattern, Sodom destroyed, Arena's altar saved, Solomon's temple filled, you can feel where this has to go next. Fire that destroys a city, fire that fills a building, and then finally fire that fills what? Hold that question. Because before the answer, there's one fire we have to deal with, and it's the most disturbing of all because it lies. Go back to the very beginning of the book of Job. A wealthy, godly man loses everything in a single day, in a string of messengers, each more breathless than the last. And one of them runs in and says, "The fire of God has fallen from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you." The fire of God. That's what the messenger calls it. Fire from heaven, falling, destroying. Exactly the pattern we've been watching, except we, the readers, know something Job and his servants do not. We were in the room at the start of the book. We know that this fire did not come from God at all. It came from the accuser, the adversary, who was given limited permission to test Job. The fire fell from the sky. It looked like judgment. It even got called the fire of God by a terrified witness. And it was a lie. Here's why this matters more than almost anything else in this video. Not every fire that falls from the sky and claims to be from God actually is. The enemy can counterfeit it. He can make destruction look like divine judgment. He can get you to blame God for something God didn't do. Job spends 30-some chapters wrestling with a fire he thinks came from heaven's wrath, when it came from hell's permission. So when fire falls, the question was never just did it fall. The question is always, where is it coming from? And what is it for? Which brings us finally to the last fire, the one I told you about at the very beginning, the one a human being could stand inside and live. This is not Sodom. This is not Carmel. This is not destruction. This is not even glory filling a building. This is something the world had never seen. A Sunday morning, 7 weeks after a tomb outside Jerusalem turned up empty, about 120 followers of Jesus crammed into an upstairs room waiting, because before he left, Jesus told them to wait for something. He didn't say what. He said they would be baptized, drenched, immersed, not in water this time, but in something else. And he said it would come like power. They are praying. And suddenly there is a sound like a violent rushing wind filling the whole house. And then the Greek phrase is glossai hosei pyros, tongues as of fire. What looks like flames appears, separates, and comes to rest on each one of them. One flame per person, settling on their heads. On Peter, the man who denied he ever knew Jesus 3 times beside a different fire just weeks before. On ordinary fishermen and a tax collector and a group of women and Jesus' own mother. Fire from heaven on people. And here's the moment this entire video has been building toward. The moment that breaks 3,000 years of pattern. It did not consume them. It did not destroy them. It did not take a single life. It rested on them. And they stood up and walked out into the street and began to speak. And 3,000 people came to faith before the day was over. And watch what the fire did to them, because it is the opposite of everything we've seen. At Sinai, the fire on the mountain made a whole nation back away and beg for distance. This fire drove 120 terrified people out of a locked room and into a public square. At Sinai, the people said, "Do not let God speak to us." At Pentecost, God's Spirit filled ordinary people, and they could not stop speaking in languages they had never learned. So the travelers from a dozen nations each heard the wonders of God in their own native tongue. The fire that had always meant keep your distance now meant go and tell everyone. And look at who it landed on. Peter. The same Peter who 7 weeks earlier had stood warming his hands at a charcoal fire in a courtyard, and when a servant girl pointed at him, swore 3 times that he had never known Jesus. The last fire Peter stood near, he denied his Lord beside it. This fire landed on his head, and he walked into the middle of Jerusalem and preached the first sermon of the church to the very crowd that had called for the crucifixion. The fire did not punish the man who failed, it commissioned him. Stop and feel the weight of that reversal. The very first fire we looked at Sodom, ended a world. This fire started one. The fire that consumed Nadab and Abihu for getting too close. This fire landed directly on top of frightened, failed, ordinary people and left them more alive than they had ever been. The fire that the 250 could not survive holding in their hands. This fire sat on Peter's head like a crown. Why? What changed? The fire didn't change. Esh in Hebrew, Peir in Greek, same fire, same God, same heaven it fell from. What changed was what stood between the fire and the people. Remember David at the threshing floor? The fire fell on the bought and paid for sacrifice instead of on the nation. Remember Solomon's temple? The fire fell on the offering, and then the glory filled the house. The whole Old Testament was teaching one lesson in fire. Holy fire cannot touch sinful people directly without consuming them, unless something stands in between and takes the fire first. At Pentecost, something had stood in between. 7 weeks earlier, outside the city wall, a sacrifice had been offered that no one bought with money, one that cost everything. The fire of judgment that should have fallen on every person in that upstairs room had already fallen somewhere else, on someone else, on a hill called Golgotha. And because it had already fallen there, when it came to rest on Peter's head, there was nothing left to burn. Let me put it the plainest way I can. Every fire on this earth survives by consuming its fuel. A candle eats its wax. A wildfire eats the forest. Fire is, by its nature, the thing that destroys what it touches in order to keep going. That is the only kind of fire the human race has ever known. But the fire at Pentecost gave its life away without destroying what it touched. It is the one fire in human history that came to rest on people and made them burn brighter instead of burning them down. And it could only do that because the consuming had already happened somewhere else. And if you want to know that this was always the plan, go back to the very first time God ever revealed his name. A shepherd named Moses, on the far side of a desert, sees something that stops him cold. A bush, wrapped in flame, burning and not burning up. The fire is there, the bush is there, but the fire is not consuming the bush. Moses turns aside to look at the one thing in nature that should not exist: fire that gives light without destroying its fuel. And out of that fire, God speaks his name for the first time. That bush was a promise the whole world forgot. God was showing Moses, centuries before Pentecost, that he knew how to put his fire on something and not destroy it. The burning bush was Pentecost waiting to happen. It just took until that upstairs room for the fire to land, finally, not on a bush, but on people. That is the fire you can stand inside and live. That is the fire I promised you in the very first minute. And now you know why the last one matters most. There is, the Bible says, one more fire still coming. At the very end, in the book of Revelation, the nations of the earth gather for one last assault, and fire comes down from heaven and devours them. And that fire is judgment again, the Sodom kind, the final kind. And after it, the text describes a lake of fire, the last and most permanent fire in all of Scripture. The pattern isn't gone. Judgment is still real. The fire that fell on the cities of the plain has an appointment at the end of history, and the Bible does not soften it. But here is the staggering thing. Between the fire that already fell at Pentecost and the fire still waiting at the end of the book, there is a span of time, and you are living it right now. The fire of Pentecost is still falling. The same Spirit that landed on Peter's head still comes to rest on ordinary, failing, frightened people who put the sacrifice between themselves and the flame. The choice every person gets to make is simply this: which fire do you want to meet? The one that already fell on the offering and now rests gently on those who come to it? Or the one still waiting at the very end for everyone who tried to stand in front of it with nothing in between? So let me give you 3 things to carry out of here. First, the truth about the topic. Fire from heaven was never God's mood swing. From the first page to the last, it is consistent. It always falls where holiness meets what is unholy. At Sodom, it fell on the unholy and destroyed it. At Sinai, it fell on a mountain and a nation could not come near. At Calvary, it fell on the sacrifice and spared everyone behind it. At Pentecost, it fell on people who were standing behind that sacrifice and could not be touched by it. Same fire, same God. The only variable every single time was what stood in between. Second, what this means for you. You are going to meet the fire. Everyone does. That is the one promise the whole Bible makes about fire from heaven. It always comes back. It came back at Sodom, at the altar, on the mountain, in the upper room, and it is coming back one final time. The only question you get to answer is whether something stands between you and it, or whether you, like the city at the gate, like the men with the smoking censers, are standing there exposed with nothing in between. The fire is not the part you control. The thing standing in front of it is. And third, and this is the one I want you to take to bed tonight, the God you have spent this whole video watching hurl fire, the God of Sodom, the God of Carmel, the God who wouldn't let Aaron even cry over his own dead sons, that same God, at the climax of his own story, found a way to make his fire land on the very people who deserve to be consumed by it and leave them whole. He did not stop being holy. He did not stop being fire. He found a way to come close without destroying you. That is not a different God in the New Testament than the one in the Old. That is the same fire, finally able to come home and rest on your head without burning the house down. The burning bush was not a one-time miracle. It was a preview of what he always intended to do with you. So here's my question for you, and I really do want your answer below. Of every fire we walked through tonight, Sodom, the mountain at Sinai, Aaron's 2 sons, Korah's censers, Gideon's rock, the flame that carried Manoah's angel home, David's threshing floor, Elijah on the mountain, the soldiers on the hill, the chariot that took Elijah up, Solomon's temple, the lie in the book of Job, and the flames at Pentecost. Which one landed on you the hardest? Which one are you still thinking about? Tell me in the comments. I read them. The sky has caught fire many times in this old book. It will catch fire once more. But for now, today, there is a fire that does not consume. It is still falling. And the only thing standing between you and it is the same thing that stood between the fire and Peter's head. The smell of sulfur was the beginning of this story. It is not how it ends. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, you know what to do. Subscribe, share it with the one person who came to mind, and I'll see you in the next one.